Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and today we are looking at the brand new Nvidia RTX 5080 Founders Edition. So this card being, well, basically today is the performance embargo, so it will be available tomorrow when you're watching this, actually a couple of days time when I'm doing this video, but the 30th of January is when you can buy the card from retailers. So today, just the performance embargo, and we're going to be comparing it against a lot of competition. So first and foremost, the RTX 4090, which we have here. Obviously, Nvidia making some pretty bold claims that the RTX 5080 outperforms the 4090 in some situations. Obviously, we're looking at multi-frame generation in DLSS 4. That comes into those claims in a big way, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And also seeing how much slower, well, I hope it is slower, than the RTX 5090, which costs twice as much. So this bad boy here, the 5090 retails for around $2,000. The 5080, as far as Nvidia's pricing is concerned, should be retailing for around $1,000. Now, both the 4080 Super, which is the card that kind of sits directly below this and will be included in the testing as well, that and the 4090 both seem to retail for way over $1,000 at the moment. In fact, some 4090s, I couldn't really find many under $2,000 at the moment. So there's still some pricing adjustment that's needed, and obviously the 5090, people camping out for both it and the 5080 at the moment, apparently, looking at some reports this morning. So basically, once we are yet to see the price adjustments with the RTX 40 series due to the introduction of the 50 series, certainly at the high end, and obviously we don't even have any low-end 50 series cards even on the near horizon. We're looking at February at the earliest for those. So a lot to talk about in today's video, but we're going to be discussing these and comparison numbers with AMD's graphics cards in the video later on as well. So thanks to Nvidia for sending this GPU over. And while I'm here, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and don't forget to turn on those notifications if you do subscribe. And what really helps me here on the channel is if you can hit that subscribe button and also like and comment on the video as well. Just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. So $1,000 for this graphics card, and you also get DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation included with the 50 series. DLSS 4 is actually being basically enabled on the 40 series cards as well. So the 4090, 4060, 4070, all those cards will support it. And essentially what you're doing is improving the performance and the image quality of the DLSS upscaling tool that you may or may not have used already. It's very, very handy. And earlier reports, and certainly from what I've seen, is that DLSS 4 can actually result in much better image quality compared to previous versions. So that's very, very good news. And the other side of the 50 series graphics cards is frame generation, specifically multi-frame generation. Now, DLSS 4 is, as I mentioned, backwards compatible with the 40 series. Multi-frame generation is not. It is 50 series specific for some very good reasons. Basically, the underpinnings of this graphics card are designed to work with multi-frame generation and just stopping everything going haywire and the images looking terrible, which at the moment it would if you applied it directly to a 40 series card. So multi-frame generation, though, is quite a significant feature because you are not just dropping in a single frame between two normally rendered frames, which you would do with normal frame generation. You're adding in 2 or even 3 frames in that situation. So what that means is that you can potentially go from a frame rate of around 60 frames per second all the way up to well over 200 frames per second just at the flick of a switch. So that is where Nvidia is getting the 5080 being faster than the 4090. So what we are hopefully going to see today is just what the impact of frame generation does for the 5080, and we're going to be comparing that directly with not just with the 4090 but with AMD's cards as well, because obviously they support FSR, and that has its own frame generating abilities as well. So we're going to be looking at a few games, specifically Alan Wake and Cyberpunk, which have the multi-frame generation enabled, and also looking at just standard frame generation in a few games as well, and a bunch of games to look at here today, and also standard rasterization and ray tracing and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully there'll be something for everybody here, whether you just want to focus on your Twitch games like Counter-Strike, or you want all the Eyecandy turned on in Alan Wake 2 or Cyberpunk. So that's it from the intro. Let's crack on with the review. First up, we should talk about my test system, which for the first time in a very long time includes an AMD processor in the form of the fabulous Ryzen 7 9800 X3D, which is also custom liquid cooled. We also have 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000 memory, and that is all powered by a Thermaltake Tough Power GF A3 1200 watt power supply. Now, if you don't want to go trawling through all of the individual game graphs and try to work out where things are yourself, we do have a couple of interesting graphs here for you, because these are based on the average frame rate across all of the games that we've tested. So if you just want a quick overview of how each card compares to each other on average, then these are the graphs for you. Now, the top graph has the 5080 is the midpoint, or both graphs do actually, but the top graph does not include any multi-frame generation results. So, for example, the 4090 and the 4080, and obviously the AMD cards do not support multi-frame generation. So it's maybe a little more comparable if you're not keen on using multi-frame generation, or just seeing the differences outside of multi-frame generation and all that kind of trickery going on. The bottom graph does take it into account, but it's not all games, it's just two of them, Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk, using multi-frame generation, and just gives a bit of an insight into what you can expect the differences to be once more games support multi-frame generation, if you're prepared to use it, of course. So starting with the top graph, and the 4090 is, as we suspected, a fair amount faster than the RTX 5080 without multi-frame generation being thrown into the mix. It's 20% faster than the 5080 out of the box, and also the star of the show here really is the RTX 5090, just absolutely bossing every single other graphics card in the graph here, even without multi-frame generation being enabled. Also of concern for the 5080 is the lack of uplift over the RTX 4080 Super. I mean, it's not single figures, but it's only 10%. I think it was around 10.4%. And it's not a massive figure really, given that this is kind of the card that it is replacing. So it's just something that we need to bear in mind, especially if you're considering upgrading for the 4080 Super. It's not really worth it unless you look at the graph at the bottom, which we'll get to in a second. The AMD cards here, obviously they don't support DLSS in one or two of the games that we've tested, so there's a bit of a disadvantage there, but that's more of a limitation of the games and AMD, rather than this being an overview of AMD compared to Nvidia. So there are a couple of significant disadvantages there. If we just looked at standard rasterization and discounted all the other stuff, then we would have probably AMD doing a lot better here, but we do have ray tracing enabled in quite a few games as well. We have disabled it in those games where possible, as well as enabling it. So AMD just struggles in ray tracing in a lot of the games that we've tested. So you can see the frame rates really dropping off when you enable ray tracing, and that is a large part of why AMD is struggling in the top graph. Now, the bottom graph, we have enabled frame generation, multi-frame generation specifically, and here we can see that even though we've only got that enabled in 2 games, the 5080 has already overtaken the 4090. So we're cherry picking those best frame rates, the average frame rates for multi-frame generation from those 2 games, and already the 5080 has leapt ahead from a minus 20% deficit to positive 1 basically. So it's 1% faster than the 4080 thanks to that fact. The 5090 kind of still the same, because obviously we've enabled multi-frame generation on there as well, and the 4080 Super now is 26% slower than the 5080. So that's a lot more significant, but obviously it relies on multi-frame generation, and you playing a lot of that to be even worth considering the upgrade. And obviously AMD here not having anything like multi-frame generation being available just yet, and obviously the 2 7900 series cards suffering a lot more here, because Nvidia is just able to dish out those massive average frame rates thanks to multi-frame generation. First up, we have Alan Wake 2, and this is a beta version, I think, provided by Nvidia, and it just enables multi-frame generation in the game. So here we're at 4K high settings, and we have ray tracing enabled, and we are going all the way up from no frame generation all the way up to 2 times, then to 3 times, then to 4 times. So looking at the RTX 5080, We can see it third from the bottom there with a decent uplift over the RTX 4080 Super, and pretty much matching the 7900 XTX, which performed pretty well in this game. The Nvidia card offering a noticeably higher minimum 99 percentile, but the AMD card offering a slightly higher average. However, we can see here that the RTX 4090 is even more out in front with a minimum 99 percentile of 92 frames per second and 135 on the average. And the 5090 obviously way out in front at 112 on the minimum and 172 on the average, and that's without any frame gen going on. So as soon as we start adding the frame generation, that sees everything kind of leap up the charts, apart from the AMD cards, which don't have frame generation in this game just yet. So the RTX 4090 here, that leaps up to 81 with 2 times frame gen, and the Nvidia RTX 5080 though with 2 times frame gen, and we have a minimum 99 percentile of 77 and average of 188, which is very, very close to the similar situation with the RTX 4090. So the 5090 though with 2 times frame gen just miles out in front with an average frame rate of 271 frames per second. Adding 3 times frame gen to the 5080 sees the minimum 99 percentile actually drop back a little bit. We've seen this in lots of other games. When you enable the multi-frame gen, it tends to knock a few frames off the minimum 99 percentile. Or 1% low, and then we've got the average frame rate skyrocketing from 188 to 253. So this is where you start to leave the RTX 4090 behind, because while the minimum 99 percentile of the 4090 is still a little bit faster, the average frame rate is well, significantly lower, like looking at 253, dropping back all the way back to 194. So finally then, adding in the ×4 frame gen, we see the average frame rate go up another 50 frames up to 309 frames per second. And the only way you're going to get anything faster is using the RTX 5090. Now dialing things up with ray tracing in Alan Wake 2 at 4K, and here the AMD cards start to struggle, as they often do with ray tracing in certain games. And the RTX 4070 Super, some way behind the RTX 5080, but not so much on the minimum 99 percentile, but the 5080 does add 10% to the average frame rate, rising to 55 frames per second. However, the RTX 4090 much faster here with a significantly higher minimum 99 percentile and average frame rates, and 5090 as well, even further out in front than that. Now, adding 2 times frame generation sees the 5080 perform a little bit better still than the 4080 Super, but the 4090 with 2 times frame gen, or just standard frame gen, just adding in a single frame, still outperforms the 5080 by a fairly wide margin. Now, dialing things up with the 5080 and going up to ×3 frame gen, which is adding in 2 frames, and we have finally an average frame rate that is resoundingly beating the 4090, but that does come at a bit of a cost to the minimum 99 percentile, which is sitting at 38 frames versus 48 for the 4090. So the final step is to add in the maximum frame gen, so the ×4, which is adding in 3 frames. And this is now seeing the average frame rate rising to 175. So getting on for, well, it's not quite twice as fast as the 4090, but it's getting there. You know, it's a good 60, 70 frames a second or thereabouts. So again, though, we see a small drop off in the minimum 99 percentile, which falls from 38 to 37 compared to the 4090's 48 when it has its frame gen on. And obviously the 5090 way out in front, and significantly so when it has its 3 frames added with the frame gen ×4. Next up, we have Assassin's Creed Mirage, and this game doesn't have any kind of visual or frame generating trickery, so we're just at 4K at ultra high settings, and we have the RTX 5080 sitting again a fair way behind the RTX 4090. However, it does manage to beat the 7900 XTX on the minimum 99th percentile, even if it's some way behind on the average frame rate. Now, compared to the 4080, there is a decent uplift here for the 5080 over the 4080 Super. The minimum 99th percentile rising from 78 to 85, so nearly 10% there, and the average frame rate rising from 101 to 107, so somewhere between 5 and 10%. So kind of maybe nearly worth an upgrade, depending on pricing, but obviously you'd maybe want a little bit more performance to be worth the upgrade over the 4080 Super. So obviously compared to the AMD RX 7900 XT, there's a significant amount more performance here, albeit not so much on the average frame rate, mainly on the 1% low. Next up is Black Myth Wukong, and we have 4K again, the cinematic, which is basically the highest graphics setting, and we also have TSR rather than DLSS enabled. So here the 5080 putting in a pretty good performance, but again it's sitting between the 4080 Super and the 4090, slightly closer to the 4080 Super, but massively outstripping both AMD cards in this game with TSR enabled. In terms of the 4090, we're looking at a fair amount more uplift there with that card, and the 5090 way out in front again. So really this review so far kind of reinforcing just how awesomely powerful the RTX 5090 is. The RTX 5080 definitely not disappointing, but obviously if you were hoping that it was going to match the 4090 outside of various DLSS and frame gen trickery, then you'd maybe be a bit disappointed. So Black Myth is pretty flexible in terms of all the options that you've got. So we've got 4K and cinematic again. This time we have DLSS and FSR enabled for the AMD and Nvidia cards. So we have the RTX 5080 again sitting somewhere between the 4080 Super and the 4090. So the 4090 again outstripping it more than it does the 4080 Super, but again the 5080 making mincemeat of the AMD CPUs, while the RTX 5090 again sits way out in front. This time in Black Myth we are enabling ray tracing, but sticking with the same resolution, the same settings, and we also have DLSS and FSR, or should I say DLSS or FSR enabled. And here we have the 5080 edging a little bit closer towards the 4090 this time, so sitting kind of squarely between the 4090 and the 4080 Super, so a little bit of an uplift there, and obviously way ahead of the AMD cards, which immediately start struggling when we enable ray tracing. The 4090 sitting a fair way out in front, and obviously if you've got the RTX 4080, there's absolutely no reason you would even want to consider the 5080 in this set of or in this graph anyway. The 5090 though, just showing what an absolute monster it is, just way out there in front. So sticking with Black Myth for one more graph, and this time we're simply adding frame generation, but this is the single frame generation with the previous version of DLSS rather than the multi-frame generation. So everything here is kind of compatible because we've got FSR based frame generation going on here as well for the AMD cards, which sadly do still struggle here. We do see some fairly significant uplifts for them, mainly on the average frame rates thanks to frame generation, but it's Nvidia that benefits the most here. The 5080 still sitting somewhere between the 4080 Super and the 4090. The 4090 way out in front here. And the 5080 though, still managing a decent uplift, close to, it's probably 8 or 9% on the 1% low, a fair amount more than that, sort of nearly getting on for 20% on the average frame rate. So 5080 here, middling between the 4080 Super and the 4090. Next up is Counter-Strike 2. So this is a game that we haven't got any kind of extra wizardry going on. We just want a straight comparison because I know that a lot of people aren't too fussed about any of the extras in this game. They just want maximum responsiveness, and that's pretty much it. So here the AMD cards actually performing reasonably well. We've got the 7900 XT matching the 4080 Super, while the Nvidia RTX 5080 managing pretty much the same, but we don't really see that much of an uplift until between the cards until we get up to the 5090 and the 7900 XTX, which is when we start to see those average frame rates rocketing upwards from 210 frames per second. So we've got 230 on the 7900 XTX and then 256 on the RTX 5090, which comes top overall. So here though, the 5080 does manage to beat the 4090 in this test, but we do have a slightly lower result for it on the 1% low. So we've got 92 frames per second versus 98 for the 4090 on the 1% lows. Next up is Cyberpunk, and this one has a whole bunch of options that we can tweak in terms of ray tracing and DLSS and frame generation and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to go through a few of the different options and compare the cards that we've got here. So first up is just straight with no DLSS or frame generation, just 4K and ultra settings, no ray tracing here either. And here we have the 5080 actually offering the RTX 4090 decent competition here, just 1 frames per second behind on the average frame rate and just 4 frames behind on the average, which is way less than 10%. So a pretty good result here for that card. It's also significantly faster than the RTX 4080 Super here as well. So much faster on the 1% lows and average frame rates. And it also handily beats the 7900 XTX. So now the only thing we've done is enable ray tracing, so obviously making the game look absolutely fantastic with some of the bells and whistles turned on. And here we have the 5080 again offering a decent uplift over the RTX 4080 Super, but here the RTX 4090 starts to stretch its legs and offers up a significant lead over the 5080 again. And once again, just the monster at the top there is the Nvidia RTX 5090. Sticking with Cyberpunk at 4K for the time being, and now we are adding DLSS or FSR into the equation depending on whether you're AMD or Intel. So AMD finally getting some half-decent frame rates here with ray tracing enabled thanks to FSR, and we have some significant uplifts for Nvidia as well. And again, the RTX 5080 offering a really good uplift over the 4080 here. And again, though, the RTX 4090 edging out even more of a lead. So really the RTX 5080 not really offering any competition for the RTX 4090. And again, just the monster at the top of the graph, the RTX 5090 absolutely killing it with those frame rates. Next up, we have our final Cyberpunk graph, and here we have enabled frame generation. So to make things a little easier to look at, I've removed the standard frame rates from the previous graph without frame generation, just to make things a little less complicated here. So obviously AMD with its own frame generation as well, so we're not leaving them out. So this is really a competition between AMD and Nvidia, and also with the 40 series cards and the 50 series cards, and obviously unsurprisingly the RTX 5090 sitting at the top, and again at the top with X3 frame generation as well, followed closely by the 5080 with frame gen times 4, which is adding 3 frames into the mix. And then we have the 5090 with times 2 frame gen, and then we have the 4090 with 2 times frame gen. So if we drop down and compare the 4090 and the 5080, we see that the 4090 is again beating the 5080 here with just the single frame gen, and or dropping in a single frame with the X2 frame gen in this game, and much higher on the minimum 99th percentile and the average frame rate. And really it's not until you add the maximum multi-frame generation options to the 5080 that it starts to edge out a lead over the RTX 4090. Our final game test is Rainbow Six Extraction, and 4K ultra settings, first of all without DLSS or any other trickery going on. And we have the 5080 in the middle of the graph, kind of sitting between the 4090 and the 4080 Super again, but much closer towards the 4080 Super. So here the AMD cards actually perform relatively well, and the RX 7900 XTX does manage to match the 5080. And again, at the top of the graph though, the monster in the room is the RTX 5090. Our final game test is Rainbow Six Extraction, and 4K ultra settings, first of all without DLSS or any other trickery going on. And we have the 5080 in the middle of the graph, kind of sitting between the 4090 and the 4080 Super again, but much closer towards the 4080 Super. So here the AMD cards actually perform relatively well, and the RX 7900 XTX does manage to match the 5080. And again, at the top of the graph though, the monster in the room is the RTX 5090. Our last graph is power consumption, and we have the RTX 5080 drawing a heck of a lot less power than the 5090, sitting at 315 watts compared to 562 watts. So you'll definitely want to be using a 600 watt power connector for the 5090 if you're using the new 16-pin power connector for Nvidia GPUs. And the 5080 though, you can probably quite easily get away with one of the lower power models that come with power supplies these days. So what do we make of the Nvidia RTX 5080 then? Well, I think we have to compare it to a number of cards out there in order to establish where it sits in the market. And even then, we're going to struggle to do that until prices settle down and we know where 40 series cards sit and all those kind of things, because we haven't seen much of an adjustment down for a lot of the 40 series cards, such as the 4080 Super and the 4090 yet. So owners of the 4090 though, I think they can rest assured that there isn't some cheap whippersnapper coming in and offering a lot more performance for less cash, unless of course you factor in frame generation. So there's no word yet on whether Nvidia is going to bring multi-frame generation back to the 40 series, or to the 40 series, I should say, backport it to the 40 series. And they've given some pretty good reasons for that, that the underlying architecture with the 5090 and the 5080 are more capable of dealing with the demands of multi-frame generation in terms of maintaining that image quality. So it's unlikely maybe that we'll see that kind of performance come back to the 4090, but the main thing is that overall in these games, even with multi-frame generation enabled, it needs pretty much maximum multi-frame generation enabled on the 5080 for it to match or better the 4090. I mean, yes, there are some instances where it's a lot faster, mainly on the average frame rate. Doesn't seem to affect the 1% lows that much. But on the average frame rates, definitely there is a case for opting for the 5080 if you're happy to use the multi-frame generation and they are mainly the games that you play. Other than that, the 4090 is still a monster. It's still a fantastic card. So hopefully you haven't thrown yours on eBay yet and you're aiming for this bad boy here, because it is still the better card as far as I'm concerned overall. Now, when it comes to the 5090, there are plenty of situations in the graphs where this thing is just a monster. And is it worth $1,000 more? Absolutely not. Unless, of course, you have that money to burn and you need the fastest card and you want to keep it until the next launch and you just want those maximum frame rates. That's what the 5090 is all about. It's not great value. It is terrible value, and it costs about 4 times as much as any console out there and a heck of a lot more than the card that we're focusing on today, the 5080, which costs around $1,000. For $2,000, it's crazy money, but you do get crazy performance with it. And sometimes it's even nearly double what this card can offer as well. So double the price, double the performance, who knows? So it is, these cards are just crazy though, in terms of what you can actually potentially do with them in terms of squeezing them into tighter spaces. I love the dual slot design, even though it's maybe not that ideal for certain sandwich style cases like the Fractal Design Terror that we've got over my shoulder there. The sandwich style, you're going to have these two flow-through fans kind of hitting the motherboard tray and potentially heating things up. Now, with the older cards, and another reason why I'd maybe stick with your 4090 for now if you've managed to squeeze this into something small, is that the second fan isn't flow-through. So you've only got one flow-through fan here. You've got a load of other vents that allow the other fan to vent its air. So that's maybe one thing going for the previous generation of cards. But the good thing is if you want to use something other than the Founders Edition, then we do have plenty of other options out there that don't have two flow-through fans. The Palette Game Rock cards, for example, 5080 and 5090 cards, I've actually got those waiting in the wings here, ready to take a look at them, and they have just a single flow-through fan, and they should perform much more like the previous generation. And even with standard cases, I've seen some reports of these cards dumping a lot of air, or a lot of hot air, into the CPU air cooler area and heating things up there quite noticeably. So that's another reason to maybe consider another option other than the Founders Edition cards here. But other than that, they were pretty quiet, a lot quieter than I thought they were going to be. And they look fantastic, as most Founders Edition cards go as well. So now dipping down to the 4080 Super, I was amazed earlier at just how crazy the prices are for those things. I think people are kind of assuming that they're not going to be able to get a 5080, or it's not going to perform as well, or something, I don't know, but the prices are still pretty crazy out there for pretty much, 4080 Super and above. We'll have to wait and see how the pricing pans out over the next few weeks. What I would say is, if you want one of these cards and you can get it for something similar to the MSRP, I would probably go for it. But Again, you have the option of going for something else, a partner card model, for example, that has slightly better cooling, or slightly different cooling, I should say, because these cards still pretty cool. Both of them well under 70 degrees in gaming, so the coolers seem to be relatively effective. But the pricing needs to settle down. I think we need to see much more of a drop-off in the 40 series, which hasn't really happened yet. And obviously the word is that AMD is not going to be competing at the top end, so that's further pushing up the prices of these flagship or near flagship cards. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen with the pricing, but hopefully it will come down a little bit for the 40 series as the 50 series cards become more established and more people want them, and more of the 40 series cards end up, you know, being sold on auction sites and all that kind of stuff, helping to drag the price down a little bit more, that kind of thing. That's not happening yet, so we have to wait for that. But if you want one of these cards now, I mean, they are extremely fast. They're 5080. Not quite matching the 4080 in performance. It sits pretty much between it and the 4080 Super, sometimes closer to the 4080 Super, which is kind of where we expected it to be. Maybe a tad disappointing, just from pulling a rabbit out of the bag and offering incredible value for $1,000 goes. Unfortunately, we're not quite seeing that here. Unless, of course, you turn on the frame generation, or multi-frame generation, should I be specific there. In which case those average frame rates absolutely skyrocket, and early indications are that DLSS 4 and the new transformer model there offers real performance benefits and image quality benefits as well compared to previous iterations of it. So it's a bit of a complicated picture, lots of different technologies going on. We haven't really seen pricing settle yet, and certainly I haven't seen retail pricing for these cards. So it's, or at least not the partner cards of these. They are meant to retail for $1,000 and $2,000 for the Founders Edition models that we got here. But yeah, a lot needs to settle down, and it's a very different situation to what we've seen before, not least of all because AMD isn't planning to compete at the top end either, so there's no point waiting for something to come in that's going to compete with the likes of the 5090 and the 5080. So that's it from me today. Thanks a lot to Nvidia for sending over the cards, and thanks to AMD for sending over the 9800 X3D, which powered today's test system. And also thanks to you guys for watching today's video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to have your support. And also don't forget to subscribe, to comment and like the video as well. Liking and commenting, super important, just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. And all the links to all the hardware that we've discussed in today's video can be found below, and plus you can check out my Amazon shop as well, where you can check out all the hardware that I've reviewed on this channel that's tried and tested and not just put in a pretty test system. I've actually tested it here and found it to be better than the competition. So definitely check out my Amazon shop. And also, if you found this review informative, you can always buy me a coffee, and always love hearing your thoughts in the comments, and I try to reply to as many comments as I can as well. So that's it from me today. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll be back very, very soon.